folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this tutorial, I'd like to show you two plugins from the Universe Distort category within Red Giant Universe. Both of these plugins, RGB Displacement and Prism Displacement, share some commonalities. In general, displacement map effects all kind of work the same way. They distort an image using the luminance of another image, generally called the displacement map or the displacement source. In the first example I'll show you, RGB displacement simply looks at the luminance of another layer. Gray areas are neutral, white areas displace or distort the pixels one way, and areas that are darker than gray distort pixels in the opposite direction. This is an important concept to remember, that 50% gray is neutral. That means no pixels will be moved if the image is gray. If you're using black, in this case I can use my fill to turn this black, we'll see that the image will be distorted where the displacement map is black. So it's important, if you don't want pixels to move, to use 50% gray. Now, if your source uses an alpha channel, let's say you're using particles or something that is just on a transparent background, you will need to define what that alpha channel is going to be. There are two options in here. One, we can say the alpha channel is gray, and that will actually merge the alpha channel with gray. If for whatever reason you need to add it to black, you can turn the alpha channel to black. In general, you're just going to want it to use a luminance map and use the luminance source. The distortion can happen independently in both the horizontal and vertical axes, and we can blur the displacement map even more if we need to, using the soften displacement map. Now you notice that this is quite colorful in here where it's distorting. This is because each channel is being displaced independently. Now by default, 2 of the 3 channels are offset from their neutral position of 0.5. So red is offset a little bit in X, and blue is offset a little bit in the opposite direction. This creates the colorful splitting that you're seeing in our checker here. So you can take these and move them around to create all different kinds of color splitting effects with your displacement map. Now, oftentimes with displacement maps like this, you will combine these with other effects that use external layers as well. Perhaps you're going to use a compound blur. So let's go to blur and compound blur, and I'll select the displacement map as the source for the compound blur. Essentially what this does is it blurs the image where it sees white, and it creates no blur where it sees black. So we've already got a difference going on between these two plugins. Compound blur sees black as neutral, and RGB displacement sees gray as neutral. So how do we get these to work together? Well, I'll go to my displacement map, set this background to 0 black. Now this is working great for compound blur, but not so great for RGB displacement. So if we go into our displacement map levels, we have controls that allow us to adjust the input of the displacement map. So in this case, what I want to do is move the black level down. I'm going to turn it down to a -100, and what this will do is neutralize the black back into that gray. Now these are both sharing the same map and playing along nicely. Now these remaining features are pretty straightforward. Stretch map to fit forces the displacement map to match the same size as your source image. That's on by default. In general, you're not going to change that too much. There's an option to use bicubic sampling, which is a slightly slower but more accurate sampling method. And there's a wrap mode, which when your distortion hits the edges of your image, you can define what is going to happen when it starts to run out of pixels due to the distortion. Is it going to mirror the pixels, repeat the pixels, clamp the pixels, that kind of thing? It's up to you. Also, you can check this box right here to view the displacement map that it's using without having to turn off your source layer. Kind of handy. Let me reset everything here. I'm going to put my displacement map back to 50% gray. And reset RGB displacement and define the displacement map source. So simply put, RGB displacement is a very straightforward approach to the distortion that it does. It looks at the source layer, it distorts based on the exact pixels that it sees. It's a very accurate and very dependable distortion map. Prism displacement uses a glass refraction algorithm. So it's a little more random, a little more haphazard than RGB displacement. So let me select this displacement map, and you can take a look at the type of distortion that's going on this checkerboard. So let me turn on RGB displacement. Even if I turn this up, I'll double these to a factor of 2. The look that RGB displacement gives is much different than the look that Prism displacement gives. In fact, you'll notice that we kind of lose the horizontal and vertical controls in Prism displacement, and we simply just have a refraction control. So the refraction is the overall distortion, and the refractive index is simply a multiplier to the glass refraction. The refraction settings are similar to what you saw in RGB displacement, but again, we lose the X and Y controls, and we just have an overall refraction for each color channel. We have the same displacement map levels that we did before, but this one adds a lighting control. So where these areas are being distorted, we can actually pull up some lighting and create a little bit of a specular effect. The 4 remaining controls are identical to RGB displacement. So what's a practical example of this? Well, often when you're working with visual effects, you want to create some sort of distortion effect. So in the case like this, where I have sort of this gun shooting a laser blast kind of thing, in this example, I like to distort the air around the blast. So I've already created what I'm going to use as my displacement map. I've simply taken the particle effects, pre-compose them into another layer, and I'm putting a choker on here. And if I want, I can add a little bit of blurriness to that. All right, so here's my plate with the particle effects. I'll set this to fit so you can see the whole thing. And I'll apply RGB displacement. I'll go to the displacement source and set that to the displacement map. Now notice it's pushing everything out because we're using an alpha channel. So I could set that background to gray, or I could go in here and say use alpha channel as gray. Okay, so we're seeing some light distortion on the air around the particles. I can turn that up, give a little bit more. Well, maybe I'll set this to about 3 and 3. In my channel displacement here, maybe I can give some more extreme color splitting by moving some of the channels around. Maybe I'll soften the map just a little bit. Now, I could also do this with Prism displacement. I can go in here, apply Prism displacement, set the source. I can also set the source to be alpha on gray. I'll soften it up a little bit and turn up that glass refraction. So that pretty much covers it. That is Prism displacement and RGB displacement from the Universe Distort portion of Red Giant Universe. My name is Harry Frank. Thank you so much for watching.